Hey everyone, I'm Bart Massey. Welcome once again to Intro to Programming. Today I want to talk about sort of an advanced topic, which is this business of working with the command line, which this talk will serve as an introduction to, as well as the more specific topic of arguments on the command line and how we specify a program's behavior with those. So I'm just going to kind of dive in at the deep end here, and hopefully we can get some understanding of working with programs in an environment where we're not using GUIs, we're not running things under Mu or some other fancy editor. We're just running programs like professional programmers mostly do from the command line, or at least historically have mostly done. So that's our topic for today, command line arguments. And to talk about command line arguments, I need to talk about the command line. Windows, Mac, and Linux all have a command line of some kind that you can get to. On Windows, you can run the program CMD from the little program finder thing, and it will start up a terminal with a command line prompt in it. On Linux or Mac, you can open a terminal, however you open a terminal on Mac or Linux, and you'll get a terminal, and there'll be a command line prompt. For Linux and Mac, the traditional command line prompt is $sign for some reason. And so right now, here at the start of this lecture, I've got a terminal that's waiting for me to type things at it. And I can type commands. I can say ls, which shows me what's here. I'm actually in the directory where all our examples are. I can ask who am I. It turns out I'll be Bart. So there's little commands like this. And the cool thing is that we can make our own commands and add them to the vocabulary. And this is nice. Once we've got this down, there's some advantages to this whole command line thing, which is that it can be faster and easier, actually, to type a command than to click around through some nested pile of menus and navigate screen stuff with the mouse to try to figure out where stuff is. Another big advantage is that I can make what are called scripts, which are sort of lists of command and acts that act like kind of simple programs that I can use to automate tasks without having to write programs in some fancy programming language like Python. And that's really common in the Unix world and the Linux and Mac world. But it's .bat files, which is the scripting for Windows, is also very popular. So those are why I want a command line and why I want to work with it. But if I'm going to be able to work with it, one of the real advantages of being able to write my own Python programs is that the programs, I can run them in a well-known way. We've talked previously about standard input, standard output, and standard error, and we talked about the command line back then too. And those are concepts that are really important for getting files in and out of the program. But the other real common thing is that things take what are called arguments, which are things you put after the command, words you put after the command to describe how the command should behave. So if we take, for an example, the word count command, WC, in Linux or Mac, I can ask how many lines are in lc.py with the -l flag and the file name. And that -l and the file name are what are known as arguments to WC. If I look for WC in bin WC is just a program called WC. It turns out that this one is a compiled program produced from a language called C. But the point is, your Python programs can live in bins as well and be part of the standard vocabulary if you want to. So how do I do that? How do I enable my program to run from the command line? Well, on Windows, there's some Python documentation, and it mostly kind of takes care of itself. But on Mac or Linux, there's some things you have to do. So let's write our own line count program that sort of emulates that part of word count. We've done this kind of thing before, but let's do it one more time. And I'm going to use just a text editor today because, like I say, we're getting away from the world of using fancy graphical editors. This is the editor I've been using since the 1980s and really like a lot. And I'm going to use this today. It doesn't really matter. You could use Moo to edit these files. It will work perfectly well for that. So it turns out that on Mac and Linux, you want the thing to start with this. And that needs to be the first line of your program if you want it to be able to be runnable from the command line. And that seems really weird, but that's just what you have to do. That basically tells the operating system that this is a Python program and should be run by using Python. The other thing you have to do is mark it as executable. Like this. I don't really need the dot slash here, actually. And now if I look at lc.py, I can see that its execute bits are on. That means you can run it. And now if I say /lc.py, that means run lc.py in the current directory, and it runs just fine. So that's how we run the programs. Of course, if you look at this program's source code real closely, you realize it doesn't actually do anything yet. So let's make it start by counting lines from standard input. And again, this is something I think we've talked about before, but it's always worth talking about again. So how do we do that? From sys import standard in for don't really care in standard in. That's just a variable named underbar. There's nothing special about that name except that it's this sort of conventional name that people use when they don't care about the variable. Now I don't have a count yet. So every time we read a line from standard input, we're going to add one to the count. And then at the end, we're going to print the count. And that is the whole of this program. We now have a line counter, which is absolutely going to work from standard in and count lines. So if I say ./lc.py less than lc.py, let's see how many lines long our program is. So that less than there means hook standard input to this file. It could be anything. It could be ftoc.py. We don't really care, but we'll just count our own lines. And it says there are 10 lines. Is that right? Well, here we are on line 10. It's the last line, so that looks good. So now we've got a perfectly good line counter, but what I'd really like to be able to do is instead of counting lines from standard in, because that can be really annoying, maybe I'd like to be able to give a file name, right? Maybe I want to just give a file name directly instead of type from standard input. Well, how do I do that? Well, it turns out that there's another thing in sys called argv, and what argv is literally a list of words, a list of strings. Each string is sort of a word from the command line invocation. So if I say at this point ./lc.py, let's just have it print argv when we start out. That'll be a good way. So this is just a list. There's nothing special about it. argv is just a list of strings. And if I say ./lc.py, ooh, then you see that you get a 2-argument list as argv. It's lc.py, the name of the program and how it was invoked, as the first argument. Usually just ignore that. And then the second argument is this foo that I typed as the next word. And if I had 4 arguments, then when I ran it, I'd get those. Notice that right now the program is stopped because it's waiting for standard input to provide it some lines to count. So we haven't hooked this up yet. We haven't got our line counter to actually use a file. So let's see if we can figure out some logic for actually doing that. So instead of just printing this, I'm trying to think the best way to make this as general as possible. I think we're not going to make it as general as possible. So I want standard error here because we might print an error message. If the length of argv is less than or equal to 1, it should never be less than 1. It should never be 0, but v never can tell. Then count file equals standard in, right? If I didn't say what to count, we'll count standard in. And I don't like this repetition at all. Repetition bad. We'll call this argc. It's kind of a terrible name. It's the count of arguments, but it's also a conventional name. Going clear back to the C days, so we'll use that. So if the number of arguments is 2, then count file equals open argv sub 1, right? The argument containing the file name for reading else print usage lc excuse me file name. So I'll put a little error message, and the reason I wanted standard error back there is because I want to print it to standard error, and then I want to exit with status 1. I want the program to stop because it failed. And so now we've got some argument processing in place, and now count file down here is either standard in if we didn't supply a file name argument to count. If we did supply a file name argument to count, then it's the file at that file name. Notice that the program will crash right now if I give a non-existent file name on the command line. That kind of error handling is something we should probably deal with in a realistic program, but you know, for this it's probably fine. So let's try ./lc.py less than lc.py. That still works. There's 19 lines now because we've added stuff. What if I, instead of less than, I just say this? Oh, still 19 lines. Look at that. And what if I say, oh, okay. So it gives me an error message and exits with failed status, even though you can't see that easily. And so, yeah, that looks pretty good. I think we've got this pretty well sorted out, and I'm pretty happy with it. So yeah, that's how you work with command line arguments. And that's pretty nice because it means that instead of having to input the file name, which gets in the way of working with the program sometimes, blah, blah. There's a lot of weird ways you could do it, but just being able to say, well, how was this program run and work with that, that's a pretty convenient way to proceed. So yeah, the arguments might be a file name or a count or whatever. It's also pretty common to have optional things. Optional things are given by what are called flag arguments. And on Linux or Mac, the flags start with minus for short flags or minus minus for long flags. On Windows, for newer programs, they're just like Linux or Mac because that's become the standard. On older programs, you might see slash instead as the thing that starts flags. But if we go back to where we typed word count minus L, that minus L there is a flag argument. And, you know, I can write Python code that looks for these flag arguments and figures out what to do. So let's add a flag argument to our program that checks to see, counts only non-blank lines. So we're going to do some stripping of the lines at this point and make sure that if the line only consists of white space, we don't count it. And that's a useful thing sometimes. So what should we give that thing? Okay, so if in this case, if the arg count is 3 and arg v sub 1 equals minus, what should we call this? Non-blank. Sure, that's a good name. And then we have to open the second argument, and that'll be our count file. And now we want to fix this so that we can count non-blank lines. So let's start with count blank equals true. And here, if we ask for only the non-blank lines, count blank equals false. And so now we have to make that all work. So now we have this thing, count blank, that says whether we're supposed to count blank lines or not. And I guess what we're going to do is say this. We need to pay attention to this now. If count blank is true, or line.strip is not equal to the empty line, then we'll add 1 to the count. So if count blanks is true, then we want to count it. If it's got some stuff in it other than white space, after we strip all the white space off, if there's anything left, then we want to count it. Otherwise, we don't want to count it. So now we've added a flag argument. And let's try it out. Let's see what happens. 24 lines, 21 lines. It says, oh, that isn't how you use this. We forgot to update our usage message, so we need to go back and fix that. There's an optional -n here. And does -n work with standard in? Maybe not. Oh, that's too bad. Kind of broke that, didn't we? So maybe we need to handle this whole count blank thing some different way. This is starting to get hard, right? Right now, we only have -n for things that have a file name argument. I guess the right way to write that is like that. We can only have -n if we have a file name. So that fixes the usage message, but it doesn't really fix our behavior. I'd like to be able to write, I'd like to be able to run this and have it count non-blank lines on standard input, but I can't. And the logic here is starting to get pretty contorted, right? I mean, this is kind of a mess, and I'm not very happy with it. There must be a better way. And it turns out that the better way here, so we've figured out how to sort of do it ourselves. Python will actually help us. It has a module called argparse, and the argparse module is a module that lets us process these fancy argument things in a really, really easy way. So I'm just going to give a little demo here. I'd encourage you to look at the argparse documentation in Python documentation to get an idea of what's going on here. Let's just do a real simple example of how to use that. And we'll unoriginally call this LC2. Guess I actually want this part, because this part seems fine. But what I want is to simplify the argument parsing. So let's see if we can clean this all up a little bit. And what the argument parsing tutorial says, which is a really nice tutorial, is to import argparse, and then we're going to make an argument parser object. Now, this is classic object stuff. So now I have a thing that's an argument parser. It's a kind of value, just like any other kind of value, but it's an object value. And that value is going to be my thing that I actually use. Parsing is a fancy name for analyzing text to understand its structure. And so we're going to be able to analyze the arguments that are passed to the program. And now it's as simple as adding an argument. I'm just going to copy and paste a line from the tutorial, and then we're going to edit it up, which probably isn't the best plan, but that's what we're going to do. And I'm going to format it to be more Pythonic. So we wanted the -n argument. We wanted its help string, ooh, fancy, to be count only non-blank lines. And the action here of store true is just the way that you say this is a flag. It can either be there or not. And that should be of some help. So now, how do I use this thing? Well, I'm going to call at some point parser.parse args, and that'll actually have it read from sys the argument list and parse those arguments to handle what's going on. And this is where you'll get an error message if you do something weird. And down here, I can just say if, instead of this count flag, if, oh, and I need to save the result here. So this is a thing that contains, this is an object that contains all the fields for all the arguments that you provided. And the fields have the same name as the arguments. I'm going to give this a long name as well. This is one of the luxuries of this thing, is I can give it a long name. And it's fine to just have separate arguments like that. So you can use either -- non-blank or -n now to get this behavior. And now let's say if args.nonblank, because that's how you say it now. Except non-blank here is the other way around. So if not args.nonblank, or we're supposed to strip, or we have a non-blank line, then we add one to the count. So now we've got it working. It only does standard input so far, but don't forget to make it executable. See what that does. Oh, count file is not defined. Where's count file? Oh, right. I forgot. I got rid of that. So we don't have a count file thing yet. So let's try that again. Hey, 24 lines. What happens if I ask for non-blank lines? What happens if I ask for non-blank lines with non-blank? Cool. What if I ask for a non-existent option? Cool. It tells me what the choices are. What if I ask it for help? Oh, look at that. It tells me minus non-blank or -n is count only non-blank lines. Well, that's helpful. That's really helpful. So you'll notice that we've replaced a whole bunch of code with less code and also made it behave much, much nicer. This is the advantage of leveraging a library. So the last thing I want to talk about here is we don't have any file name arguments. We need to put those back. And I think that the easy way to do that is to try to get a list of the remaining arguments interpreted as files. And that starts to get a little fancy. Let's just try to get back to where we were for starters. Let's see. I want to I'm going to do it this way just for now. I think that there are better ways to do it, and maybe the final code that you'll see later is not so much, but let's just do it this way. Now, the given file, and here we're going to say type equals file, and I don't know if that's going to work or not. Let's give it a try. If not, we'll make it be a string and we'll open the file ourselves. And now we'll put some of our logic back. If args.file count file equals else count file equals sys.standardin. We'll put this back to count file here. Yeah, we're going to call this count file because otherwise I think we're going to have some naming conflict issues and I just don't want to deal with them right now. All right, let's try this, see what we get. Oh, I was afraid of that. Okay. Stir is a valid type. There we go. So we'll open it ourselves. There we are. If I say minus n, great. And if I say minus n minus f, lc.pi, it does the right thing. And there we are. And if I say dash dash help, I now have a thing that takes a given file to count, and it counts that. That just scratches the surface of what the argument parsing library can do. I encourage you to read the argparse documentation if you want to build fancy things with this. But the point is that now you have a way to have your own commands. By the way, there's nothing that says this file name has to have .py in it. I can rename this to lc2. Now I can say ./lc2. And that's fine. So now I got a thing that looks more or less like a normal command. And if I copy it to some place where your operating system finds commands, a so-called bin directory, I happen to have some stuff in this bin directory, then now it's ready to run it and I can just use it like any other command. I'm going to move it back to rename it back to lc2.py because I think that's a better name in this case, but yeah, that doesn't work because I didn't tell it what file name to use, but there we go. If I give it the -f, then it does that. So that's command line argument processing. It's a great thing, and I highly recommend getting used to this style of behavior because once you get used to running Python scripts like this from the command line, there's a million powerful things you can do with that. So I hope that was helpful. Please stay safe and well out there during this difficult time. I look forward to talking to you again soon. Take care.